Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming to the second of 3 debates that's featuring over the course of the conference. This is a debate on game scripting systems. Specifically, it's a debate about whether or not designers should be allowed to write code in a scripting language. The topic of the debate is sort of written as a negative statement that designers should not be allowed to write code in scripting languages. As a result, our affirmative speaker, Marty Poland, is essentially going to be against the designers, whereas our negative speaker, Isaac Berry, will be in favor of the designers. So it's a little bit of an inversion from the normal format, but I think that's okay. Marty Poland is the CEO of Shady Logic Studios, and Isaac Berry is creative director at Gamehouse. Both these guys have been in the industry for a very long time. Before we get started with the debate proper, I wanted to talk a little bit about the subject of designer scripting and why it's relevant, because the topic is actually quite relevant outside the realm of just programmers and designers in sort of an eternal battle. It directly reflects on the quality of the products we make, the efficiency of producing those products, and the costs involved. And I think both of these speakers will kind of detail out how. But I wanted to share a story. I suppose I should introduce myself too. My name is Brandon Reinhardt. I work at Valve Software. I'm a designer and a programmer, so I guess I'm kind of caught in the middle of this particular topic. In fact, I've been involved in both sides. So I wanted to share a story. I worked at SOE for maybe like 3 years on Star Wars Galaxies, sort of in the middle of my career. And during that time, we were using sort of a stripped-down version of Java to do a lot of our gameplay implementation. The design team was writing shipping modifications to the game directly in Java, and our process was not very strict. So quite often we had this code going directly out, being patched directly out to live servers without a process of peer review. And obviously, some of you are probably already cringing about that. In one case in particular, one of the designers on the team implemented a system for fireworks, where you could launch fireworks into the air. You had this device you put on the ground, you loaded it with some fireworks, and you used a context menu to shoot fireworks into the air, and it was all pretty, and so players were messing around with that. It was implemented all in scripting language by the designer. Unfortunately, the commands that UI connected to, all slash commands that you could type into the interface, they weren't properly gated, and there was no security on them. And the designer, who didn't really have a background in systems design or argument handling or any kind of fundamental sort of programming stuff, didn't really check to see what was being passed in as arguments to those commands. And players discovered that they could launch anything. They could type /launch while targeting a mission terminal, and it would shoot into the air and explode in some pretty colors, and then the server would delete it. They could launch other players into the air, and they would explode in pretty colors, and then they too would be deleted. It causes a lot of problems in an MMO when you do a direct delete on the object associated with the player. You're not supposed to do that. Usually there's a complex process of logging out the player, making sure any associated data is properly handled, and so forth. But no, we just deleted them directly, creating a lot of toxic data in the database, and it hosed the game. As a result, we had to go through this process of backing up or restoring. We called it like a time warp or whatever. We had to restore from a previous image of the game, roll back the change, and so forth. At the same time, despite the horror stories of that particular case, I would say that we were able to produce a lot of content in a very short amount of time because our designers were able to write in scripting languages. And I'm not sure if the product, even though in a lot of ways it might have been more robust, I'm not sure it would have necessarily been better if they hadn't been able to do that. So whether you're a gamer or you're involved in marketing or in management or you're not directly associated with programming or design, this is still a really important question, and I think you need to understand both sides of the debate so that on your own projects you can make an informed decision. It affects how you develop your product pipelines, production pipelines, and what actually you ship, the actual code that you ship to customers. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. I will be sitting down here, so you're not going to see me too much through the course of the debate. The first session, just give you an overview of how this works. The affirmative speaker, Marty, will give a constructive speech, followed by a cross-examination from Isaac. Then Isaac will construct his position, and Marty will cross-examine him. Then both speakers will have a period of time to rebut their opponent's position, and finally they'll give closing statements. After the closing statements, we'll open it up to field questions from the audience. So I'm going to turn this mic off and sit down there and start time. And when I call, go ahead and start. If you guys can turn that off.
All right, Marty, you have 6 minutes for constructive.
Cool. Okay, how many people in the audience have experienced crunch time? Raise your hands. Okay, everyone just about. Crunch time is sort of a symptom of how we develop software in the game industry, and part of that we can bring back to, gee, maybe we overscoped what we were doing in the project, maybe our code wasn't what it was supposed to be, maybe we made a lot of mistakes along the way. One of the mistakes that we seem to make over and over again is this idea that somehow we're going to get up to the end of the project, have all of our code just sort of sitting there, we're going to test it all and get it all out the door, basically within the same month. In the rest of the software engineering world, that's been pretty much debunked as the long way to go. Instead, people have turned around and said, maybe we start to make testing part of our overall process. Maybe we make software development something we do iteratively, and we actually control how we put together software. And we train engineers specifically in not only object-oriented programming, but systems design, and ensure that we're creating quality software throughout the entire process. Then we can start actually, figuring out whether or not we can meet our goals, and rather than having crunch time at the end where we're all working crazy 24-hour shifts to try to get the product out the door, we can instead turn around and say, great, we actually shipped the product on time, and it met the requirements. One of the things that probably wasn't put in the introduction was that currently we're working with another company right now where I am managing their technical development in several MMOs and helping them rework their development process as well as content and workflow pipelines for both game and web. And during this, we had a chance to examine not only how we're doing, development of the game in general, but also what we should and shouldn't be doing. And one of those was, of course, whether or not we should have designers doing scripting. It's not an easy question. And part of the reason it's not an easy question is because there's so many talented people out there. If you look out there right now at some of the great things that are happening with the new tools that are out there, whether it's Unity or whatever, you can have a relatively small team that may only be just a programmer with design sensibilities and an artist, and all of a sudden they've got a cool little game. The problem with that is it really doesn't scale. In order to get a lot of extremely talented programmers that can also design and put them together to make a team that gets things done is, well, it's hard enough just getting talented programmers in this industry. Anybody who's gone out and actually tried to do it recently understands that even in this recession, to get really good programmers is difficult. By the way, we're looking. But if we start putting designers in the place of programmers, we have two problems. Number one, they're not part of the development team, they're not part of the process, and they don't have the ability to actually work within the framework that we put together. And that actually causes our software not to have not only the quality that we're looking at the end, but they jump out of the process of actual software development. It causes more maintenance problems because I'll give you a typical example. A typical example would be a designer coming in and say, great, I want to do this particular function. And they go, well, I've done something like that before. And they find another piece of code, they copy that code, they paste it into what they're doing now, and they modify it a little bit. Presto Magico, hey, look, it does exactly what I'm looking for. And this process gets repeated over and over and over again throughout a level, in fact, throughout multiple levels. Then later on, one of the designers comes back and says, hey, this is marvelous, but I really want this to work a different way. All of a sudden, the maintenance that we have to do on our code, since it was effectively block copied from place to place to place, has gone exponential over what we would do if we would do it in the normal course of software development. Instead, you have to do it over and over and over again, and maintaining that code and testing that code becomes sort of the impossible challenge. we can just, people go, oh, well, you can just throw it at more testers, but realistically, throwing it at more testers isn't going to get you where you want to go. If you look at the statistics right now, just in software development in general, 33% of your profits, if you go 6 months over your release date, you're going to lose that much. Okay? In the game industry, it's worse. If you don't make your deadline, you're toast. We have to make our deadline. And at the same time, we have to ensure that the software is not only solid, but that the scope doesn't go beyond where we need it to. That we can actually perform to what the designer's vision is. And I propose that if we have scripters doing both jobs, that we don't get what we really need to do, which is programmers developing content delivery systems and designers creating great games.
Okay, thank you. Isaac, you have 3 minutes for cross-examination.
Okay. Do I have 20 minutes, or 20 minutes? Do I have 20 seconds to prepare for this, or is that?
Yeah, you can take some time to prepare. 20 minutes is a little long. Unless you're asking a really good question.
Won't be.
Okay, that's probably it for
Yeah,
prep.
that's it. So, 33% of profits if you run 6 months over. Is there a way that you can relate that to how the use of a scripting language in the game affects that percentage? Like, what is the impact on your project based upon when you use script?
Is that a question I should answer right now?
Sure, is it?
This is you guys, not me.
Okay. Certainly, while I have a specific bias against scripting languages, but we're not here to debate scripting languages. What we're here to debate is whether or not it's effective use of resources to have designers programming the game. In the perspective of the 33%, 33% is if we go over. Okay, if we've got people that aren't qualified to do the job and aren't part of the team that is specifically focused on delivering that content delivery framework and ensuring that it's bug-free and gets to market on time, then at that point you're much less likely to actually deliver your product. This is a disciplined engineering art form rather than necessarily an art. While small teams can deliver, large teams have to have some discipline and process.
Yeah, that's fine. So, when you say that designers don't make effective programmers, could you give me just sort of like a boilerplate definition of what a game designer is, and then could you give me some potential titles for game designers?
Rather than do that, why don't I have you describe what a game designer is?
Dude, you get that time.
Ask you the question.
Okay. Game designer is the person who actually has the vision for the game, who understands not only the game mechanics, but the overall flow of the user experience. And these are the people that are necessary to make sure that we have fun throughout the process. They look at the narrative, the timing, and ensure that the player experience from end to end is what it's supposed to be. Now, that's a big job, and it's multidisciplinary all on its own. You bring in psychology, you bring in level design. Gee, we've got the spatial relationships of this, we bring in architecture, this whole litany of different tasks that are necessary just to do decent level design without even getting into programming. Is that
Yeah, that's fair. And then could you give me just like a definition of a game system? And part of this is just so that we're speaking the same terms, because this is often a problem in game development is really using the same language. So when you say a game system, can you give me an idea about what that scope is, or what that form is?
If we're talking about the scope, that's typically, I think we're talking about level design specifically.
That's time, but you can have a quick answer.
in level design, you have FX systems, you have gameplay systems, you have a number of interactive systems, narrative, etc., and tutorials. Pretty much a large chunk of the game is actually exposed at that point, so many systems actually can be interacted with.
Good. Isaac, you have 6 minutes for your constructive.
Do I get another 20 seconds? Can I fill my water?
What's that? Yes, you fill your water. Any prep time you take, he can use as well. So.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Right, that's 20 seconds.
Okay. So I think that part of the problem for me when I was working on this is that I misunderstood a lot of the assumptions that were behind that statement. And so when I agreed to do it, I work in a casual games business. And in the casual games business, we have a bit of a different model and a set of different concerns. They're similar, but different in nature to MMOs. And so when the question of a scripting language, whether or not game designers should be allowed to write game systems in script, came up, and I kind of did like a little vetting around the office. I had a bit of a problem because I could not find anybody who disagreed with me. But that's often a really, really bad sign because it means people aren't thinking very well. So I started looking at this resolution and thinking about the context of the problem. And I do definitely understand a lot of the classic issues with
They want to help me anyways.
The problems with the languages such as performance and the fact that game designers tend not to be programmers, and I certainly accept that. I would say that game designers also don't tend to be artists in the visual sense, and game designers also don't tend to be sound designers. There are a lot of things that game designers don't tend to do, but a lot of times game designers are asked to do. And then in some cases, you have in the industry a segmentation of our roles where game designers are required to do certain things. So sometimes game designers are absolutely required to script, and that knowledge is important because what you're actually dealing with this resolution, with this issue in general, is you have certainly part of it that has to do with performance. And by performance, I don't mean performance of the scripting language itself, I mean performance of the people that are actually implementing the scripts. So naturally, you wouldn't have, say, your receptionist or your custodian come in and implement game systems using the scripting language. Oh man, I should use that. But you may have a designer who was a programmer, or is trained, or because of their scripting language and the way that your game is architected, should be writing script. So part of the thing is, where we'll probably end up is at a very reasonable middle ground position, where it kind of depends on your case. So in the case of my company, for example, we're actually moving towards script. Of course, we're moving towards it carefully, but part of the reason is that we need to be able to iterate as quickly as possible, which is one of the main strengths of the scripting language, is the ability to make changes in the system behavior, and also in the system architecture. So that, and sorry, when I say system, I also have a game designer's understanding of systems. So I'm thinking of game systems, things that I can implement with cards, I can implement on a board game, I could implement it using a scripting language through a series of sequences and procedures and properties and objects and things like that. Yeah, so there's this issue about whether or not the people are using the tool properly and the tool that is at hand. And then there is also one of the ownership about who is responsible for the architecture and the structure of the game. And a lot of that touches on those issues of maintenance and aptitude also. But I find that it is interesting because there is definitely a change in the way that games are being developed and the ways that games are being developed effectively. And one of those things kind of inherits from a model of development that started outside of. Sorry, I'm closing my eyes a lot. Started outside of software development. It's called Lean, and a lot of the traditions of Lean production kind of turned into things like Agile development, Agile programming, things like that. And it's all about this idea that you need to be able to react to conditions, and you need to be able to change and iterate and move ahead. So the reason for using scripting languages often are about the ability to be flexible, to be iterated, and to not have all of the particular low-level problems that you have when you're using something like C++. But then, the next breath, the engineer that is explaining this to you will then tell you that it's still for them. It's not for game designers. And this is very, very reasonable because game designers are very stupid people. But that's just hyperbole, sorry. Sorry. Gotcha.
You're doing fine.
Oh, I know. Okay, don't worry. I'm going to be working on this guy. At any rate, so we have this issue about the tools, we have this issue about performance, we have this issue about game designers not being very smart. And what we're actually trying to deal with is still the same thing. We need to iterate, we need to be able to create a game that's good. And in this new model, we're beginning to understand that game designers as the vision holders is probably not an accurate description of what game designers are really good at. Inventing certainly we have a lot of aptitudes, just like engineers have a lot of aptitude for developing structural systems or technical systems. Game designers tend to have a lot of aptitude at creating play systems and creating fun and thinking about player emotions and all of those things that Marty correctly identified. But it happens a lot closer to the road than it does or has worked traditionally. So instead of creating a set of requirements and then creating a very detailed specification that meets those requirements, and I understand that in the MMO world things are a little bit different, and there's risk, and it's definitely good to document RP systems out and all that good stuff. But everything is about moving closer and closer to that end user, adding value to the product, and continuing to change it to the needs of the reality of what you're dealing with, the system that you constructed, because we, of course, are creating these dynamic systems, and again, I'm talking systems in gameplay terms, so that they're not always behaving like we think that they are. What we thought was fun before actually isn't. And so we're trying to support these emotional experiences by constructing these game systems, and we need tools that allow us to do that flexibly. Now, scripting, or script languages, are a tool. They are a means to an end, but they are not the end itself. So then where we get to with this resolution is we begin to start to ask questions about what do we mean by scripting. Time? Was that time?
What's that?
Is that time?
Yeah.
Okay.
Marty, you have 3 minutes cross-examination.
I'd like to start out by really saying in front that, as far as I'm concerned, if you're doing small online casual games and things like that, that a talented interdisciplinary individual, somebody who is a really good coder, who is a really good designer, is probably the person that you do want to have develop that product. Because they know both ends of the pipe and they know what they're building. Okay, it's going to be much more efficient. The problem, once again, is that doesn't really scale. And because that really doesn't scale, how do you put together a team that you can segment the responsibilities in such a way that the job gets done and you develop your products reliably? From what I've seen, getting a whole bunch of people that actually get on all
Is there a question?
the board. Yeah, they will come to that.
Okay.
From what I've seen, putting together a team of people that hit on all cylinders across the board is not only difficult, but getting them to agree on the same product is even harder. Not having a central design authority, not having, or having people question that actually leads to dilution of the product. How would you actually achieve scale with what you're talking about, where any particular designer can effectively code the game?
Okay. So, first off, I'd just like to say that I'm really grateful that the reality of these debates is actually that we're talking about the problems and we're not actually just working the debate game itself, because I gotta say I was scared shitless. Yeah, so that is actually a big problem. And when I was thinking about this and how I was going to debate this statement, which is that game designers should not be allowed to implement game systems in script, a lot of the thinking that I did had to do with semantics and how I was going to just totally bust up a dictionary and play the statement apart. But, so in the case of smaller games, I think it becomes more and more relevant. But I think that there are ways that you can do it when the products need to scale into something like, say, an MMO. So one of the things, again, is changing the role or your mental model of the way that designers fit into your process. And you're kind of designing your gameplay systems from the top down in an iterative fashion. So the very first thing that you might do is you might define all of the high-level aesthetic goals for the project, right? So all of the things that the game has to do. And then what the game designer is doing as they're continuing to distill these goals to finer and finer levels and create systems that are, like in some ways, are templates for these goals, is you're in the vision holding way, you're kind of honing that vision and you're sharing and distributing it among the team. Because one of the things that you want to do is you want to empower all of the people who are making creative decisions in your product to really have an understanding of what the game is, have their own ability to make decisions about what that game is, and to make decisions that actually fit within it. Now, I'm not saying you take your hands off the wheel, absolutely not. And one of the questions I was going to ask when you busted out metrics was, I put it under here, under
That's fine.
Do I continue on?
No, it's
Do I get to
your turn
finish?
for...
You got to finish this.
Go ahead.
Okay, and so it was what percentage of teams use pair programming. So I do think that it's possible to have processes that can allow designers. And the other thing is, like, when you start reading about the uses of scripting languages, the programmer will say, you know, you don't want a designer to touch it. It's got to be a programmer, but it can be a new programmer. So it can be a programmer who's incompetent or not very good. It just can't be a designer. And I know that's not what he meant in the spirit, but I think in the same way that you would mentor that person who's fulfilling the role of scripting, whether they're a programmer or a designer, if you need somebody in that role, I think that there are ways that you can do that so that it will work in an environment that needs to scale.
Okay, thank you. Marty, you have 5 minutes for a rebuttal speech.
Yeah, having been in this industry for a little while and worked with quite a few engineers, as well as designers, what I find is that, okay, I have a little bit different vision than some people have as far as engineers in the game industry. When I hire on an engineer, the first statement that I make to them is, well, I ask them, you know, what do you think you're doing here? And invariably they go, dude, I get to make a game. And I reply to them, no, you don't get to make the game. That's not your job. Your job is to make content delivery systems and tools that feed that pipeline. If that's what you're here for, then you can be part of a great game development process where we're enabling designers and artists to create one of the coolest things on the planet. And that's cool. But when programmers start to think that they're designers, that they're in charge of the game, then what ends up happening is we start making decisions about what content can and cannot go into the game. Okay? The programmers enable themselves as the designers. And from my perspective, that's sort of the wrong way to look at this. Okay? When we've got everybody fighting about what the design is, we're not going to be productive to get where we need to go. Instead, what we should be concentrating on is developing tools that enable designers to get their vision directly into the game. Make data-driven designs that allow a designer to come in and actually put the models where they need to go ahead and have the narrative put into tools that actually expound into the game rather than necessarily having to code that up. Whenever the designer has to focus on the intricacies of what the systems are, they get limited by them. If instead they can come back and say, gee, I have this problem, and have the development team look at all of the scope of what they're doing and say, I can come up with a solution, that empowers them rather than limits them. So by dividing up the skill set, we divide up what the people actually need to do. We divide up the responsibilities. We divide up the tasks in such a way that each team can actually execute on where they go and we can work together to get a really great product. Was that 3 minutes or 3 seconds?
That was 3 minutes.
Oh, hey, we're keeping going. I'm not going to really argue the merits of scripting, because it really won't do a whole lot of good. Probably I'll be as divisive as the rest of the conversation here. But I will argue the merits of process. If we don't have proper process on larger projects, then the chances of us actually getting to the finish line are probably somewhere close to none as far as doing that on time, without what we call heroic programming or heroic content development. And that's what the game industry needs to get out of. By having each of us trying to concentrate on too many balls, we can't concentrate and focus on what's important. I was talking to a designer today who actually did work on SOE, maybe you worked with him, where he commented that, gee, if the designers instead were allowed to focus completely on game design, rather than where you ended up, which was basically being able to play Uncle Owen in Star Wars Galaxies, you might have right off the bat been able to play Luke Skywalker. Okay, that it made the code base so brittle that it was actually at least 20%.
That's a low blow.
I'm not.
Also, you have 1 minute left.
Thank you. If I make another comment like that, do I get 2 seconds left?
No comment.
And that he was saying at least 20% of their time was just maintaining the code as far as what the designers were doing, rather than actually implementing new gameplay systems. From that perspective, that was scary enough, and that was probably an underestimate. But what was more scary was when I asked him, if you had to look at the probable profits of the game, if designers had been able to focus completely on gameplay systems and making a great game, and you had the tools to actually develop the game the way you needed to, what would be the difference in overall revenue do you think that you would have gotten? And he said, you know what? We probably made 20% of our potential at most because we weren't able to implement the systems that we knew would keep the customers.
Okay, it's about time.
Okay.
Isaac, you have 5 minutes for a counter rebuttal.
Counter.
Yeah, it's probably not a word, but
Okay. It's tough because I actually found very little to disagree with in what you say. I'm just thinking about the context of utilizing a tool such as script and where it differs from using, say, data-driven systems. So when I create an NPC and I have a form, and I can give that NPC a name, and I can give that NPC properties, and I can place that NPC in the world. Okay. When I can assign that NPC behaviors, data-driven, and I can get callbacks from triggers, perhaps. And I can start to assemble using, I think Joe Ludwig said on one of the posts when I was doing a little bit of reading on this, building blocks. Use those building blocks, I can put those things together. So I could make a mom, I can make a daughter, and I can relate those things together using these building blocks. And I can place those building blocks around in the world, create behaviors. And I'm not scripting, I'm using a data-driven system. If I have a node graph that I can manipulate, and I can select nodes from that graph, and I can set them into the world, I'm not scripting, I'm using a data-driven system. Okay. If I can use elementary logic bits, and I can sequence, and I can produce logic, using a data-driven system, and this is a legitimate question, I'm not being attacked, within the definition of that system, am I allowed to use logic elements?
Yes, actually.
Okay. So then I can have logic elements that I can place, however, arranged, using this system. I can create entities using that system. Am I only allowed to create entities that already exist, or can I create new classes of entities? Like if I have an orc, can I create the orc -5 head?
Well, that would be a different property, of course, surely. Okay. Manipulate properties.
So if I can manipulate the properties in the objects of a system, and I can manipulate the relationships in the objects of a system, and I can manipulate their behaviors, then I'm actually creating game systems using the building blocks using a data-driven system, which I think is totally reasonable. If I take that system and I project it into the future, and I can now, instead of interfacing with my computer and placing nodes and clicking and clicking and clicking, I can, if you go to YouTube, you can look up something called Put That There, And to put that there, I can point at the screen, and I can say, put that there, make 2 copies of that there, this is the mother of this, and I can build these relationships, and I can do that all. And I'm using a data-driven system, using a new interface, which I think is excellent. But maybe we look into the future, and we know that that technology is not going to be there, context recognition doesn't work, all this other stuff. So we go ahead and we put that back into a textual language, and now I have a text language that's in a series of paragraphs. And I'm saying, put this here, put that there, and now I'm scripting using a data-driven system. I kind of get a little bit confused about where it all comes together, but I'm using this language, and but it's a custom-built language. It's not a general-purpose scripting system. It is just a specific scripting system that I can use to create these same behaviors. So then when I start thinking about it in those terms, where I end up is that this, whether or not we can script or not, is actually kind of a distraction. I mean, I do believe that you're right, that there are certain types of systems, certain types of operations that game designers should just not be allowed to do. But I guess where I get stuck is that I just see scripting and script languages as a tool. And I see that, as with any tool, its use is just as important as the form of the tool. And the intelligence and skill with which that's used is just as much an issue as as how it operates. I mean, there's really no one or the other. There's no music without the instrument and the musician. They go together, and you can't talk about one or the other. So, in the same way, I have a difficult time being able to support the resolution that a game designer should not be allowed to implement game systems using script languages simply on that fact. Now, I can't argue with your data because I think it's absolutely spot on. That 33% of game designers are idiots, and then 33% of your profits if you're in 6-month overrun, but like 20% they could have like increased their revenues. And I'm not saying that Star Wars Galaxies didn't suck balls, but it's. I don't think they were going to get space flight if they didn't have scripting. I just don't think that would happen, and I still think people wanted to be Jedis.
Right, that's time. All right, Marty, you have 5 minutes for closing statement.
Okay. There is no doubt that there's a little bit of a fuzzy line that we all have to cross when we're starting to think about scripting languages, what they are, what they aren't. When we're starting to look at what it means in this specific argument as to whether or not they should be allowed to use scripting languages, there's no doubt that data-driven systems are, a little bit on the edge. But the big difference is that the programming or engineering team actually gets to call out what they feel is safe. They need to call out and say, you know what, it's okay for you to use this behavior that we've actually developed and tested, and as long as you're going ahead and changing these parameters, you're good to go, because we've tested all of those parameters. No matter what you put in there, it's validated, and we ensure that this is actually going to work within the game as you expect it will. When we're talking about scripting languages, for the most part what we're talking about is general purpose scripting languages. Scripting languages that allow you to do significantly more than the rest of the development team, the programmers, have validated will actually work in the environment. If everybody starts just putting whatever code they need to create the entity that they're putting together, then the testing requirements on that go up substantially. And then instead of, gee, I've tested one entity and I know all the parameters that can go into that entity, and I can test it once and pretty much be assured that this is going to work every time, what we end up with when we have sort of a general purpose scripting language that any designer can come by and sort of tweak, is that every single entity has to be thoroughly tested, because we don't understand the number of combinations that are actually going to be built into these systems. Now, that isn't to say that designers aren't intelligent, because unlike Isaac, I don't necessarily think that 33% are stupid. Maybe it's some other percentage. Design's hard, okay? Art's hard. And when you do engineering right and programming right, it's hard. It's work. If you don't have the right process in place, it becomes harder work. And the more we spread that out through all the disciplines, the harder it is to keep the focus on the ball that we actually have to hit over the fence. Each of us has to concentrate on that ball. not on, whether or not I think that designer's got a good idea, because it's not my business. Okay, I'm the programmer today, and as a programmer, my job's about enabling him to get that wall over the fence. And I think every designer should be excited and should challenge their engineering team to make them the biggest bat with the sweetest spot where they can take that ball and hit it over the fence and get all the customers that the business guys are looking for to make sure that we have a great industry.
Okay. Isaac, 5 minutes for closing comments.
Okay. I'd like to thank you for meeting me up here, and I really have enjoyed this. I was really glad because I was able to think a lot more than I was really just going to go right after the definition because I was scared. I would encourage you to think about the programmer's role and all of the roles of the people that are on your teams. And I can't speak to the specifics of your business, but if we were ever working together, and that would be really cool, and I pitch you some stupid idea and tell you to make it, please, God, you would have to let me know. But furthermore, if I came to you and I had a problem using the tool, I would expect that you would support me in that and you would help me use that tool. And if that tool happens to be a general purpose scripting language, then I think we could find common ground and we could make it work. And I think that it is absolutely a bad idea to put game designers into a boat with text editor and scripting language and 2 feral cats and send them out to the wild because it will in fact cause problems. But I think just like any other tool, scripting languages have their use depending on the scale, depending on the project, depending on the culture. And absolutely, process is important. I think that what will eventually happen though is we'll just continue to look to sort of new thinking. Companies like Toyota will really focus on what sort of in Lean is known as the value stream, the beginning and the end of all products, and thinking about only processes that add to that value stream. And anything that doesn't, we'll want to remove as waste. And one of the biggest wastes that Toyota looks for when they're looking at a process is time. Any time that it takes to move materials, any time that it takes to move to a station, any time that it takes to shift gears, to change process, to do anything at all, they want to remove that. And scripting tools are a tool for eliminating time. Again, it doesn't mean that we do it without intelligence. It doesn't mean that we do it without consideration. And it certainly, as we just all know, doesn't mean that we ship anybody off onto their own to do it. And everyone in the team needs to be engaged, artists, programmers, designers, and it's partly cultural, partly process, and it's absolutely, as you have indicated, it's 100% game.
All right, thank you.
So, let me get my mic turned back on here. I don't know if it's been on the whole time, but there we go. So, I'm going to turn this over to the audience for questions, but actually, I have a couple of my own questions I wanted to ask that I thought of over the course of the debate. The first one is that I think Isaac made a really compelling argument in his first rebuttal about the sort of slippery slope of this design or data-driven tool that the designers are using. Specifically, you allowed him that this tool could perform basic logic, that the designers can put together logic. And it seems to me that one of the costs of designer scripting is the sort of spaghetti logic that you get from them writing in Java or Python or whatever language you happen to be using. But once your data-driven tool allows them to construct loops or increment counters and make logic changes, you get into that debugging problem yet again. So how is that solving the problem that would exist if they were writing in some scripting language?
And before you answer that, can I ask a naive question?
Sure.
Does logic have to involve loops? Does it have to involve those kinds of
I'm coming from the position that certain things that you would just want the game to do would involve some basic logic construction, like if this, do this instead. Even if you just have a counter, you could count to some number that's way beyond the end of the universe or something, and the program would clock up or whatnot.
I think that perhaps I was a little bit too liberal in my term of saying a lot of logic.
So you're backsliding.
No, not really. Because what logic is in most cases is, if this, do that. In this particular case, there's going to be programmed in, if this particular piece of data is higher than this value, then something's going to happen. Now, to say that the designer is going to go in and write in, if this, do that, that's not what actually we're referring to. We're referring to them being able to manipulate the data, the imperatives that we're working off of, so that the entity does what it's supposed to do. No, we're not talking about letting them go through and add a whole bunch of logic on top of what's already been programmed in the system. Those are two different things.
Okay. So, another element of the debate was this idea that you presented, or apparently, the way things are done at your company, that programmers aren't really involved in the design team. They serve the design team, but they don't have any. Do they not practice any due diligence over a designer's idea? If he comes to you with a really bad idea, and says you got to do this, and your programmer thinks that may not be a good idea, do they just say, well, he's the designer, I'm not. You should go ahead and do the idea.
In any organization, anybody should feel that they can go ahead and ask a question. Okay? Not necessarily go in and change the system because we've decided that this is the way it needs to go, but ask a question. And if we don't have a good answer for that, then maybe it's bad for us.
Okay, so you would say you do have a healthy system in place for programmers to raise concerns?
Oh, absolutely. Okay. For anybody. If the janitor comes up and says, dude, you're really screwing up, I probably want to listen to him.
Why can't that work the other way? Why can't a designer who builds some logic, has a question about how the logic works to write it efficiently, go to the programmers and have the programmers help with making it more effective or teaching them?
I wouldn't want him to, quite honestly. But at the same time, it's not his job to implement it. He is not part of the process to actually ensure that this is quality code that gets out the door on time. His job is to actually make sure that the design is everything that it can be. And part of that is challenging us to build the right tools.
Okay, so the final question is just for you, would just be, from my perspective, if designers at your company or any company you work with are not putting together logic, and if they're just using these data-driven tools, what exactly are they doing, and why hire them? It doesn't seem. I asked that from the Valve perspective, where we don't hire designers that write documents. We don't hire designers that they have to put bits in the box, is the phrase that we like to use. If they're not producing something that actually ships, they're useless. So it seems to me that, well, I guess the question is just, what do you think of that particular perspective?
Each company works a different way, and that may work for you.
Okay.
And that would be great. But
So,
if not, how we...
All right. So,
aren't you also providing tools outside of the products that you're making? So you're not just making games, you're also providing technology for them.
Correct.
Which makes sense.
So, Isaac, you seem to express some derision to the concept that designers might be incompetent, as if upholding the idea that maybe they're sort of smart. Do you feel that designers have been given a fair drift in this debate, or has it sort of been maybe broken off a little bit inside them and twisted a little bit?
No, it's just a gag. It's just anything I can do to get people out there to laugh. I don't really have a clear argument to construct. I just got it.
So if a designer had this tool to put together logic, do you think on average they would produce quality work, or that they're simply incapable of learning how to produce that?
No, absolutely. Everybody's capable of learning. I mean, the thing is that it wasn't until I've been a game designer longer than I've been a programmer, because I'm not a programmer. But before I learned anything about programming, I was a game designer, and it wasn't until I started to learn about programming that I actually began designing better game systems, which is probably, I'm not sure what order you fell into, but I don't think it's completely uncommon. Although I also designed better game systems once I learned about systems thinking, started building systems diagrams that way. So there's a lot of tools. I've seen designers do some really awesome stuff using script languages. I actually built a game system, oddly enough, for Scarface, which was this open world, violent, awesome game. And it was strictly pretty much a tool for designers to use in building missions. And I used software patterns to do it. I had an object factory. In fact, I called the entire thing the mission factory, and it managed resources because they weren't being done.
And you're a designer, not a programmer.
Correct.
Oh, I could have thought that you were a programmer.
No. I was interested, and I applied a little bit of time and learning. And I mean, like, I learned a lot of those things while I was building that structure. And ultimately, I think they ripped every bit of it out, and they fired me. They didn't actually fire me. Actually, one of the programmers there was really nice guy, and he said, you should be a programmer, which was just totally, I had no sense of assessment or value. No, I shouldn't. But I was able to iterate very quickly, and I was able to get a system that supported what the designers did. And it wasn't a really, I don't know, I'm not a programmer, so I don't know the proper word. The big O notation was not big. It wasn't really a complicated or complex thing, so it was allowed to persist for quite a long time until, because it was a PlayStation 2 thing, you had to scope it down, and they converted that core into C++. But like looking now, just a few years ahead, I totally could see if we didn't have those memory constraints, we would have shipped that because it did what we needed it to do, and it functioned in a way that was fine. So there's that part, which are the technical systems, but then I also spent a lot of time thinking about game systems, and so like I totally had this whole thing all architected where we were going to talk about these data-driven things, I was going to talk about those tools, and then I was going to create a game of assassin just using data-driven systems, and then do that.
So your experience through this made you a better designer, and in addition...
Sure, but if I needed somebody, back to that initial statement that I made, if I needed somebody to fulfill the role, and where I was getting at with the whole game designer definition thing is that we have level designers who, in the industry, who need to be somewhat graphically inclined. They need to understand how to lay levels out, or world builders, let's just say. And then you might have mission designers, and they need to know how to do some level of logic and scripting to construct these very interesting sequences. And cinematic designers, there's just the word designer is just not big enough. And so when game designers should not implement game systems in script, it's just not fair. It's a really tough argument to pin down because there can be so many different roles.
So, I mean, I can say I honestly don't know which way to go because, I wouldn't want to own a company with designers shipping crap code that's crashing the game and costing me a lot of money. I think that's a very strong argument. At the same time, I think particularly what you just said about designers becoming better at their job of being designers because they're writing a script and they're working with logic, I think that's a very strong argument too. In addition, the slippery slope, I think the slippery slope argument just makes it even harder. It makes it even more important that designers and programmers work together to find some common ground. And one of the comments you made was just that it made me feel that it wasn't clear whether you felt that programmers could practice proper due diligence over designers and vice versa. So it's definitely an interesting topic. I do want to get some comments from the crowd, maybe 2 questions before we close things up. Yeah, go ahead and respond. I'll find something.
Okay. Quick comment just to what we've been talking about. Not only do programmers need a lot of process, but designers need a lot of process too. What actually is missing in some companies as far as design is the ability to take that design apart, bring it into use cases, and bring it down to a point where a programmer can grok what's going on, and where the designer actually understands what the logic is that he's requiring the programmer to actually execute on. That allows not only them to think through, and to an extent, they're thinking about programming logic, if this, then this. But it also explains the systems in such a way that the developers can execute on that with all the other constraints, whether they be energy, security, the speed that they actually have to have these things work, and get it to work right the first time.
Your very first observation, where good programmers are rare, are hard to find now, and you asked everybody here if we have experienced crunch time, and everybody does. So in the context of MMOs, where you have always those crunch time and those huge quantity of features to integrate and to balance and to do, who's gonna do those features? I mean, is it the programmer? You can't just find enough good programmer to do the job, so you're going to hire bad programmer just to do cheap work, or or are you gonna let a good system, scripting system to the designers so that they can balance? And let's face it, after the launch, there's still balancing to do. So you don't want to keep that huge quantity of programmer, which costs a lot more than designers. So, what do you think?
I assume you're asking me that question? Okay. So, a while back, somebody was saying, well, why don't you just hire yet another programmer to go ahead and get that done? And in this particular case, I'm looking for a lead programmer. I said, well, I could do that. I could add another programmer, I could add another programmer, add another programmer. The problem is that they'd be working on the wrong thing. They wouldn't be actually making a system that we could reuse and that we had faith in to ship the game. Instead, they would be just doing make work. And designers shouldn't have to do make work either. Okay? At the end of the day, if we don't have the staff to execute on our vision, then we should scale back what that vision is. And the way we figure out where that scale is to sit down and discuss the design. Rather than develop the design as we're making the game, to sit down and discuss the design at checkpoints along the process and say, what are we building, what do we have time to execute on, and how are we going to make it to the finish line together. And we can't do that if each of us are doing design every step of the way, every line of code as we go. Instead, what we end up doing is developing this divergent product that doesn't actually have much to do with the overall design or the needs of the business going forward. Does that answer your question?
Well, yeah, but even if we know that kind of stuff, we still are always in crunch time. Every game company has big rush time all the time. So, and everybody knows that. It's always easy to say, okay, well, we're gonna sit and discuss about what we can do now, but still, there's.
So I do want to move on to another question.
I want to thank you guys for a really interesting and thought-provoking debate. Earlier, in the beginning of the debate, I sort of called out, hey, let's make sure we're getting some of the definitions right. But one of the terms that I don't remember anybody defining is programmer. And it seems to me like that's the definition of programmer. Who gets to be in the programmers union is kind of a key part of this thing. And so, I'm sitting here next to Brandon, and obviously he goes both ways, and Isaac is considers himself firmly in the designer camp, but he's doing scripting. I'm a programmer, but will be reporting to an art director. Where does the line get drawn? Is it your experience? Is it your title? Is it where you are in the organization? What matters to determine whether you're a programmer or not? And I view that as a question for both of you.
You want to start?
Sure. No, I don't have an answer to that. It's not something I really thought about. Who determines that? It's largely probably role, first and foremost, and then you hire into that role, so you have people who are programming. Yeah, it's Wittgenstein all over again. It doesn't have to be somebody with a CS degree. It really has to do with the role. So I think that a good case could be made that if you had a scripting designer and that person just wrote Lua all day long and that was what they did, they're a programmer. If they happen to be a Brandon Reinhardt and they're doing game systems like the Scout update in whatever that game is that he's working on, he's a programmer, a designer programmer. And when you're talking about the context of the design work that he's doing, sure, you can call him a designer. I love definitions as much as the next guy, but it's who gets to, I don't know, maybe you have a better, solid setup.
In how I look at organizations and how they develop as they grow, we have to start sort of divvying up what the responsibilities are. Whose job it is to make sure that the art's great and wonderful? Whose job is it to make sure that the design is what it needs to be? whose job is it to make sure that the platform is engineered appropriately so that all this content can be delivered? Once we've segmented that out and we've selected the great and wonderful people that are supposed to, hit on all cylinders in those positions, it's up to those people to select the team that can execute to the overall vision of the product. And who's the programmer? It's the CTO or the lead engineer who's hiring that individual who determines who's a programmer and who's not. Because if they're not a programmer, they're not going to hire them, they're not part of the team, and they're not going to execute to the architectural vision of what they're putting together when it goes out the door.
I'd just like to say something to that, and it's interesting because I think it's also about the perspective of the studio and the projects that you're working on, because the more that I kind of think about process or about team composition, I see certainly a specialization that's happening, there's more and more specialized roles, which is so much more to do, but what's strange about that is in that specialization I also see a real need for more interdisciplinary culture to exist, so that I might have a technical artist that's working as part of my sub-team on a larger project, but that person, and this kind of goes back to something that I was saying earlier, but that person is also, and maybe this is just because designers aren't very good at what we do, but he's also helping me do the design. He's also part of that decision-making process, and it's not just like a neat bin that I can put one person into that role, even though they're doing a very specialized function that they're kind of tuned to do. They still absolutely need these kind of inputs and outputs that are allowing them to sort of fit in with the rest of the team. And so as I see teams going further and further forward, and it may just be anecdote, it may just be personal experience, I'm not sure. It seems like the teams I work with, even when I'm working with specialized people, they are providing a broader range of functions while being narrower. I don't know exactly how to explain that, and I'm contradicting myself, but it certainly seems like, I don't know.
When I look at what's going on in the game industry, and especially as the projects grow larger and larger, having a designer that actually groks all the different variables that are going into a game, the social aspects of it, the usability aspects of it, trying to make sure that these systems are not only deep enough that people can execute on them and have fun with them, but at the same time, something that is accessible and, from moment one in the game is something that everybody is engaged with. That's a difficult job. They become, they bring in psychology, they bring in human factors engineering. There's all sorts of things that bring into that. And not letting people focus on that big problem is difficult. Not to say that we shouldn't all work together, absolutely. And yes, it does have to be a collaboration here, absolutely correct. But each person should be empowered to focus on the biggest problem that they've got on their plate and making sure that that's done as well as possible.
And just as you were talking about, what struck me is that really kind of what we're getting around is you and I are not always speaking about responsibilities and functions and operations in the same terms. So I definitely see that we had a lot of agreement.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. Actually, this has been an awesome debate. Especially near the end, I feel that you guys started to dig into some pretty interesting stuff. In fact, I think it could be an entirely separate debate topic of some interest, which is the role of the designer and the role of the programmer, how that splits down the middle, and whether it even splits down the middle. Because on one end, Marty, I feel that you're taking this sort of rigid but professional position on the role of the programmer versus the designer. And Isaac, you're coming from a more sort of the intuitive feel of what it is to be a designer.
Oh, God, no.
No, you don't think so? All right.
Oh, and by the way, I'm a little bit of a heretic because I do design as well.
Oh, see? now it comes out.
It's self-loathing.
If you guys could give it